It's great to welcome to the program today Timothy Morton, who's an ecological philosopher at Rice University, also author of the book Being Ecological, out with Penguin and MIT. It's so great to have you on today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. And if I couldn't do things like this, I couldn't think. You have to sort of work with other people to be able to do that if you're me.
Well, let's do it. I mean, I think maybe to start, let's define some terms a little bit. I think that maybe the term ecology and ecological is not often understood by many. There's sort of something in there that relates to the environment. There's something in there that relates to climate change, probably, or maybe not. So can we maybe start with defining what the field is and what we're talking about?
Well, the funny thing is that the word ecology is like the word economy, and we sort of know what economy means. Economy means like how you organize your house, actually. That first two syllables, the eco bit means house in Greek. You know, incoming, outgoing flows of money and whatever. And roughly, it's sort of to do with how you organize your enjoyment, right? You know, like I'll give you 50 cents and you give me this ice cream. It's a very cheap ice cream for some reason. Um, Ecology is, in a way, the logic of that. It's the logic of where we live, how it works. And the funny thing is, of course, is that classical economic theory doesn't seem to have anything to do very much with coral or mountains or whatever. But I guess we're finding out right now just how connected these things are. That actually by ignoring some of the things like coral and mountains, we might have got some things a bit screwy with our economics, with our way of doing it.
So
So
what would be
yeah.
some examples of maybe the questions that would be the questions that the field considers?
Oh, well, one very strong question would be, at what scales is this thing happening? Right? Like, in a funny way, ecological awareness just means being aware that things are happening on more than one scale at once. Say, for example, you start your car. Now, that's actually, you know, on a planet scale, statistically meaningless. You haven't done anything. You shouldn't feel guilty in a way. I like to say that maybe there's a difference between guilty and responsible. Then billions and billions of those are doing something. So there's a funny paradox, which is that on one scale, nothing's happening. On another scale, everything is happening, and it's the same thing. You're doing the same thing.
So in the field of climate change and environmentalism, one debate that exists that I think is a better one than does it exist. I think that that's not a good debate at this point. But one is personal responsibility versus corporate responsibility. So the discussion of plastic straws and getting a car with slightly better gas mileage or whatever the case may be. And a
Right.
counter to the entire framing of those questions is that this is not really about the decisions of the individual because the overwhelming, I think it's, 70% of emissions come from just 100 companies or something like that. So that the conversation is actually happening at the wrong scale.
Mm.
Within the ecological framework, as you say, there's the little action and things are happening on multiple layers. Is there a particular level of zoom, so to speak, that is the predominant one in the questions you deal with?
Well, you're quite right to suggest, I feel, that the individual scale is a little bit too small, and it also brings up questions of good and evil. Like, am I doing this right? You know, what's the right shampoo to choose? I've got 200 shampoos in the shop, and I'm confronted with them like this giant ice flow, only it's made of shampoo, and I have to figure out which one to do. And it's quite alien, you know. And of course, there's an awful feeling of powerlessness when you're thinking about something happening at planet scale. And I'm old enough to remember those things in the 90s where in the media, sometimes people would say things like, if we just did this one thing, like save toilet paper or jump up and down on the spot for a while, then this would happen. If we just did it for 2 weeks, then this other amazing thing would happen. And it's as if the onus is put on us as individuals. And I like to distinguish between guilty and responsible. I'm doing this interview across from Chevron and all those companies because I work at Rice University in Houston. And it's quite clear who's guilty in a way. Like some people knew that global warming was happening and that and so forth quite a long time ago, rather like the cigarette situation. On the other hand, everyone's responsible, and it doesn't mean that even that you have to prove that you did it. All you have to prove is that you can understand it, right? Like if you see somebody running in the street and they're going to get hit by a car, you're responsible for that person, and you don't have to prove even that you did it. And even maybe it might waste some time. You might be trying to prove that you did it with a calculator, and suddenly the person got hit anyway. So in a funny way, I feel like taking a lot of that guilt off of people's shoulders, and I feel like people like me often make ordinary people feel stupid and evil, and that's probably why our message isn't working so great.
What is it that when it comes to solving the problems that we're dealing with, you see as the biggest impediment? Because it's very easy, and I think at least partially accurate, to say that there are significant corporate interests that stand to lose a lot of money if we actually start dealing seriously with the problems that we're having. But that, I think, is only one piece of it. So are there others? There's this idea of analysis paralysis, of endlessly seeking facts without a path forward. I'll just open it. What else is preventing us from solving this?
Mm. The way that we talk to each other about it is quite inhibiting. I'm sometimes like to think that it's not exactly what you think that could start World War IV or whatever, but how you think. Yeah, like there are different ideas, for example, about what the word believe means. Does believe mean hold on really, really tight to something and never let go? Or does believe mean something more like trusting, just sort of allowing things to be the case? And so, in a way, it's to do with what we think, all these deep things about what does believe mean, what does responsible mean, and in general, how do we act in groups? I mean, we on our daily lives, we're members of lots and lots of overlapping, intersecting, different sizes of group. And if we're going to work with this global warming stuff, it's a 7.5 billion group problem. And that's a big challenge, actually, to imagine ourselves as part of a group without thinking that the group is like this glass of water in which we just dissolve like salt or sugar and we don't really mean anything and we don't really exist. And it's a tremendously inhibiting to think. And again, perhaps it's a hangover from not so great aspects of some religion, that feeling like you're part of something bigger makes you feel like you don't count.
Yeah, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond talks quite a bit about the size of groups in which humans can function in different ways and to different degrees. And it seems that when we're talking about ecology, we really are talking about the planet. I mean, everybody is part of it in a sense, and that seems overwhelming to some degree. Is this the role? Is this why we have governments? I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, and maybe you're not pessimistic, but how do we wrap our mind around how to solve a problem of that scope and size?
I have awful trouble with negative feelings about this. I feel badly a lot. It's one of my favorite hobbies is feeling badly. And I feel like if I'm just lying there in the fetal position, on the floor, which is how I feel sometimes when I hear this data, there's nothing I can do about it. So I have to figure out how to scrape myself off the floor and get up and do something. So one has to feel somewhat confident in the face of the awfulness. I think really that what we're dealing with is obviously it's a problem to do with knowing that what you do at one scale might suck at another scale, right? Like very crudely, knowing that everything's sort of interconnected on the planet means that if you're going to be nice to bunny rabbits, it means that you're not going to be nice to bunny rabbit parasites. So part of it is this Groundhog Day situation. If you remember the film Groundhog Day, Bill Murray tries to get it right. He keeps going through the same day over and over again. And he realizes he can never, ever save the guy who's going to get hit. And that's a little bit like ecological awareness. There's always going to be some flaw in your plan. But that doesn't mean you should not try to carry it out. And so part of it is, realizing that we're always going to feel a little bit like hypocrites, and we're always going to wonder exactly why we're doing what we're doing. There aren't quite enough reasons all the time.
When it comes to action, I mean, do you think on those terms, is there, when we look at fossil fuels, trash, plastics, the oceans, the ozone, all of these different things, is there even something that you would say should be the areas of focus at this point?
Oh, well, actually, it's very easy for an individual person to realize that actually the best thing you can do as an individual is to eat a little bit less meat. If you're wondering what to do right now, and you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this. And the way we talk to each other about it is so triggering and sort of PTSD. And you open the paper and it says, 500, 16%, 20,000 years. And it's all so confusing. And then there's another lot of data dumped on you the next day, and then you read the editorial section and it's like, oh, you're really evil, you're bad, And so no wonder people feel put off. But actually, there's something very simple you can do while we're waiting for people to do bigger things, which is eat a little bit less meat. It's amazing how much fossil fuel emissions there are in agriculture. And if you want to do something right now, I would seriously advise that. As you've got a car, and if you do, and it's probably quite expensive to pay it off, maybe it's better just to focus on the food right now and not worry so much about the car aspect.
That's interesting, and that's something I try to do and I advocate for. And yet, if I recall correctly, I think agricultural emissions are something like 13% of total emissions. So we sort of are back in this position of, even if we all did it, we're dealing with maybe a tenth of the problem. And is that maybe what gets some people to do nothing instead?
I think so, yes. There's a feeling of paralysis. And, I guess one of the most important things in the short term is to remember to vote. Figure out who can represent you, who can work some things out politically in larger groups. It's probably more effective than anything, I think, right now, even though some things may seem more seemingly direct and sort of more obvious or flamboyant. For regular folks, I think just figuring out who's the right person to vote for with all of this is probably the best tactic right now.
In thinking a little more broadly, like maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, are individual conversations where you try to convince someone who simply doesn't believe that we are affecting the climate and our planet, is that a worthwhile conversation to have? Or are those sort of vestigial remains, so to speak, that will eventually go away, and that's not really where our focus should be, arguing with people about whether it's real?
Gosh, that's interesting. Well, the funny thing is that, the wondering whether it's real or not is in a funny way a symptom of the fact that it's real. I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident, but when you're in something like that, some kind of traumatic situation, the thought is, gosh, is this really happening? And all around the world, people are going, is this actually for real, this global warming, mass extinction thing? And that's actually a signal that it is happening in a funny way. Another thing to say about this is that that kind of conversation where you try to convince someone, probably that kind of conversation has hoovered up as many people as it possibly can now who want to believe this stuff. I think it's probably more effective to have other kinds of conversation that don't necessarily aren't so direct. Like, for example, have a conversation about responsibility. Again, maybe jellyfish did this, but because I can understand it, I'm responsible for it, right? And because I've got fingers that can switch off the keyboard switches that switch off the oil pipes, I need to do this because dolphins can't do it because their flippers can't work the keyboards.
That's it. So the idea in thinking pragmatically then is that although there's nothing wrong necessarily with trying to convince people, but that has been going on for so long that the convincible people likely already have been. Am I sort of understanding what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I feel like, I was in the local burger place. I live in Texas, and so Whataburger is our Texas burger place. We're all very proud of it. And I had just seen an incredible retired ballet dancer do this incredible performance of this Debussy ballet in Paris. And then the person who served me the sauces, because someone comes with a tray with the sauces at this place, came to the table to serve this. I thought, gosh, you are handling yourself as gracefully as this ballet dancer person in Paris. And, people like me make people like you feel stupid and evil most of the time. No wonder we haven't started fixing this thing. Obviously, there's other things to blame, but who can I blame but myself if the situation isn't going so great? Any situation, right?
I don't know if you've seen the Democratic presidential debates that have taken place so far, but if you have, I'd be curious to know, what is your assessment of the way in which these issues are discussed, whether it's climate, fossil fuels, energy, whatever? I mean, in terms of the questions that are asked is sort of part A, and in terms of the framing of the answers as well.
Gosh, that's very, very deep. And it's very, very important because, again, I feel like how you do a thing is the thing in a way. It's not an optional extra. How we ask ourselves questions about this and how we talk about it. And it seems to me that the way it's talked about quite often um, is, perhaps some of the solutions are right, but the language is very technocratic and it's not very democratically empowering, and it's not scaled so that you don't think like, what can I do as someone in my neighborhood, right? Like, what can I do as someone who lives in a street or lives in a town? Of course, there needs to be trans-state international action on all of this stuff. And yet, and at the same time, I think the way we talk about it makes it seem like this very scary alien thing. And it is scary, but it better not be alien, because if it's alien, then it's just something that happens, like fate or destiny or nature or whatever, the old word nature, the idea that things just sort of happen without your will. And this is something that we have to input our will into. So the way we talk about it is a little bit stifling, I feel. That's a very good question.
What would be an example of a question that you would like to hear from moderators posed to the candidates that would maybe be more encompassing or framed in a better way?
Mm. Um, how do you think neighborhoods and local communities can organize to affect ecological political change? Would be my number one question. Just to get people in the mindset of thinking, this is a thing we can do. Like, we all live in a neighborhood. And in a funny way, the neighborhood is sort of a very good unit of political change. It's not individuals, it's a group, but it's small enough and it's connected enough to your actual physical location and who you are and who you know, that it's got this reality to it.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm imagining it being asked, and I just know that the candidates, at least that we currently have, would, if you're lucky, give an answer that is even tangentially related. I mean, that's one of the things where one of the critiques I've had of the debates is that the format doesn't really allow for depth. But the other issue is that on a lot of these issues, the candidates don't really know more than 2 or 3 talking points related to the issue. And that just seems like more of I mean, this is not an area of expertise really for any of the candidates, I think, unless you think there's someone who is better on this issue.
Yeah, no, I think, obviously, someone like Bernie Sanders has got the right idea of the scale of funding involved to make this problem go away. But again, it's sort of about owning this as an issue. When you read the paper, it's almost as if we are continually surprised, for example, that hurricanes affect poor people and black people, for example, worse than white people or well-off people. And you sort of think to yourself, gosh, what else in social space do we treat like this? It's as if the hurricane is coming way, way from the outside of our knowledge. And it's like, shock horror, bad thing affects poor, suffering people worse. And it's like, well, what doesn't do that? We should be owning this right now and sort of figuring out how to become more familiar with it. Otherwise, it's just this huge, daunting mountain of data that we're looking at, like freaked out romantic poets or something.
Yeah, I mean, your book, Being Ecological, is not about beating people over the head with facts, but how would you sort of summarize the effect you would hope the book would have on someone who reads it?
Oh, well, I got asked by Penguin to write this book, and I thought, gosh, Penguin, you've given me a golden microphone to talk to people, and I'm a scholar. I don't get out much. I don't get to talk to people. So it's like, how can I use this opportunity right? And, people like me say, we have this horrible phrase, what is it? Appeal to a wider audience. That's so condescending. I personally think that making a nice thing for lots of people to read is upper level, in a way, from being right in that heavy duty medieval way that happens in universities. I'm making a kind of rubber stamping motion with my hand because that's how it sort of works. Whereas, being interesting, there's a philosopher called Heraclitus. He's an ancient Greek philosopher. And he says something very beautiful I love very much. He says, the truth can't be directly stated. You have to evoke it, right? And all this direct stating and pointing and this is bad and you're a bad person, it's just not. I mean, I'm quite a defiant person. So if I hear this kind of thing coming to myself, I tend to resist it pretty strongly. So my sense of the project is just basically trying to very gently evoke things, which ends up becoming more powerful, actually, than yelling. There's a very good phrase I heard once about the novelist Marcel Proust by one of my favorite philosophers, actually, a guy called Theodor Adorno, a German philosopher. And he says something very beautiful, which you could also think about Jane Austen if you've never read Proust. He says that Proust destroys the aristocracy with remorseless gentleness. That's the phrase that he uses. And I like this idea of gentleness can be more effective than aggression. You think about the nonviolent direct action, things that have happened, Martin Luther King and so on, and you sort of see the point of that.
I'm going to phrase this last question in what maybe is not ripe for an academic answer, but if 0 is total pessimism and 10 is total optimism about figuring this out before we destroy ourselves, where are you?
Well, 2.5 cheers for ambiguity, because on the one hand, as far as understanding this issue goes, I'm at a 1 or a 0, pessimism of the intellect, as they say. As far as feeling like we've got this, actually, if we can do this, it just takes a little tiny adjustment to get into doing this. I'm at a 9 or a 10, actually. So it's very ambiguous for me. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's my slogan.
So the answer is, depending on where are you from 0 to 10, the answer is it depends from where you are measuring in some sense.
Yeah. It's either 0 or 10. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. That's what I say.
We've been speaking with Timothy Morton, who's an ecological philosopher at Rice University. The book is Being Ecological. Timothy, so great having you on today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.